The heat over Rio Seca rose like a living thing, curling off the cracked earth as if the desert itself were breathing. Out of that shimmering haze walked a woman carrying a newborn against her chest. Two thin boys trailing behind her like shadows that refused to fall. Dust clung to her lashes, her dress, her skin, yet nothing in her face suggested she had the strength left to brush it away. Still, she walked. Jonas Flint, the eldest, kept a hand on his little brother's back, as if one stumble would send them all collapsing into the desert. The baby whimpered, the wind swallowed the sound whole, and then hoofbeats, slow, steady, unhurried. A dark horse emerged from the glare, and atop it a man with a badge catching the late light like a warning. Sheriff Graham Walker reined in, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat as he looked at the woman. The boys, the dust, the hunger. Something in him stilled, something in her braced. The road between them held its breath. The road into Rio Seca was a long ribbon of dust curled between ridges scorched, nearly white by the 1881 drought. Heat sat heavy on the land, pressing against skin and bone alike, turning the simple act of breathing into a dry scrape in the throat. The settlement itself was little more than a cluster of sun-bleached buildings, an old mercantile with warped boards, a saloon that leaned slightly south as though tired of holding itself upright, and a scatter of adobe homes clinging low to the ground in defiance of the wind. Farther out stretched a plain, the color of old brass, tufted with brittle weeds and creosote bushes that crackled when the breeze passed through them. Margery Flint felt all of it against her skin. Every gust of wind stung her cheeks with grains of dust. Every step tugged at the muscles of her legs, worn thin after weeks of wandering from town to town. Her dress, once a warm shade of russet, had faded into something closer to earth-torn hem, frayed sleeves, a fabric that trapped heat but could no longer shield her. She shifted Emmett higher against her shoulder, feeling his slight movements, the tremble of a child too hungry to cry. Jonas walked close to her right side, eyes scanning the street like a scout twice his age. Oliver clung to her fingertip, his small body trembling each time the wind dragged a trail of ash-scented heat past his face. It was a scent Margery knew far too well. It was the smell of endings. Her gaze lifted toward the mountains to the west, where the ridges broke the horizon like jagged teeth. In the late afternoon light, they shimmered under a veil of heat, blurred at the edges like half-forgotten memories. She used to love mountains. Before the fire, before the sound of collapsing timber became a phantom noise that lived in the back of her mind. Now she kept her eyes low, avoiding the streaks of reddish smoke drifting from a distant brush burn. Though she felt Jonas stiffen beside her, he heard it too, the echo of a night that had stolen their home, their safety, and their father. When Graham Walker drew nearer, the sunlight carved the hard lines of his face into sharper relief. His skin carried the deep, even bronze of a man who lived outdoors more than indoors. A faint scar curved along the underside of his jaw, disappearing into the stubble that shaded his cheeks. His eyes were steady, pale gray with a hint of blue, and they swept over Margery and her children in a way that felt more like assessment than intrusion. The badge on his chest glinted, dulled with age but still clear enough to claim authority. Yet there was nothing oppressive in his stance. He sat tall in the saddle, shoulders square, reins held loosely in one gloved hand, the posture of a man accustomed to being obeyed but not addicted to being feared. Somewhere, in the set of his mouth, beneath the sunburned lines, lingered a tiredness that did not come from the heat. It came from years of quiet disappointments and a marriage that had cracked long before it shattered. Graham did not speak of these things, but they lived in the slight dip of his eyebrow, the way he exhaled softly through his nose, and the absence of a ring on the leather cord tucked beneath his shirt. Margery met his gaze only briefly, but it was enough to sense the weight behind it. His was not the stare of a man sizing her up for trouble or charity. It was something more measured, more cautious, as if he recognized in her the same quiet fracture he carried within himself. Her fingers curled around Emmett's blanket, knuckles pale beneath dust. She was prepared for someone to tell her to move along, that Rio Seca had no room for wanderers, no mercy for widows, no place for children who looked half-starved. But Graham did not speak those words. Rio Seca watched them from shuttered windows in shadowed doorways. The town had seen strangers before, but the drought had thinned everyone's patience. Still, the sheriff remained where he was, a lone figure on horseback in a world that seemed intent on shrinking itself. The wind tugged at the edges of his coat. Margery stood rooted to the earth, body tense but unbroken, between them. The dust swirled like a veil waiting to be lifted. The sheriff dismounted without a sound, boots settling into the dust with a weight that felt deliberate rather than threatening. Margery instinctively pulled Oliver a fraction closer, and Jonas stepped half a pace ahead of her, small shoulders squared, jaw locked in a way that reminded Graham of men twice the boy's age. The wind quieted for a beat, as though the desert itself leaned in to hear what might happen next. "You look like you could use water," Graham said, his voice low and even, shaped by sun and sand. He didn't move toward them, only lifted the canteen from his saddle and held it out at a distance where she could take it without stepping too close. Margery did not extend her hand. Emmett stirred against her collarbone, mewling softly, but she kept her eyes on the sheriff's boots, then his belt, then finally his face. "We won't cause trouble," she murmured, the words brittle. "We just need to rest a moment. Then we'll move along." Graham studied her, not the way a man studies a stranger he hopes to get rid of, but with a quiet discernment, as if he were measuring the truth in her voice. "Didn't say you were trouble," he replied. He set the canteen on a flat stone a few feet away, then stepped back. "For the children." Jonas hesitated only long enough to meet his mother's eyes. Margery gave a tiny nod. The boy darted forward, snatched the canteen, and retreated again, shoulders tight, eyes sharp as a fox in the open. Graham watched him, the faintest shift in his expression, approval, maybe ghosting across his face. Oliver clung to Margery's skirt, gaze fixed on the sheriff's badge. "Is he going to take us away?" he whispered, voice barely forming the words. Margery shook her head too quickly. "No one's taking you anywhere," she answered, though she wasn't certain she believed it. Graham heard the child's fear but chose not to address it. Instead, he glanced toward the sun sinking toward the ridges. "Nights get cold," he said. "Colder than folks expect this time of year." Margery's fingers tightened around Emmett. "We'll manage." He weighed those words, the defiance in them, and the exhaustion they failed to hide. "There's space in my barn," he said finally. "Dry, safe. You're welcome to it." Margery stiffened. "We don't want charity." "That's good," Graham said. "I'm not offering any." The wind swept between them again, pushing a strand of her hair across her cheek. She brushed it away with a rough, trembling hand. Her gaze drifted toward the open land beyond town, a horizon so wide it seemed capable of swallowing them whole. She had walked too far to believe safety existed anywhere. Yet something in the sheriff's voice, its steadiness, its lack of demand, pressed against the wall she'd built around herself. Jonas spoke before she could. "We can work," he said, chin lifted, "if that's what you want." Graham looked at the boy a long moment. "Work's always needed," he said quietly, "but not tonight." The silence that followed was deep enough to hear the flutter of a sparrow lifting from the saloon roof. Margery glanced once more at the open land behind her, then at her sons, then at the sheriff, who did not avert his eyes or soften them. Trust did not bloom, but something shifted, an imperceptible tilt, in the world beneath her feet. "Just one night," she said. Graham nodded once, and that was all. They followed him as the last light bled out of the sky. Not close, not far, just near enough that dust from his horse's hooves trailed over their footsteps like a thin, protective veil. The path to Graham Walker's ranch wound beyond the last adobe homes of Rio Seca, cutting through fields of brittle grass that rasped against one another in the dusk wind. The sun dipped lower, laying long bars of gold across the land until everything fences. Cacti. Dust seemed dipped in burnished light. Margery followed the silhouette of the sheriff and his horse, keeping enough distance to escape the illusion of relying on him, yet staying close enough that her children didn't have to fear the empty space between them. When they reached the ranch, the smell of old wood and hay wrapped around her like something half-remembered. The barn stood tall against the fading sky, weathered but steady, as though it had endured more storms than it bothered to recall. Graham dismounted and unlatched the side door. He didn't usher them in. He simply stepped aside, creating an opening without insisting they walk through it. "You'll find clean straw in the loft," he said, voice softened by the twilight. "Blankets, too. They're rough, but warm." Margery didn't answer. Jonas studied the sheriff with narrowed eyes, then turned to his mother, awaiting her cue. She felt the familiar ache in her shoulders, a tension born from months of having to weigh every decision as though the world might snap beneath her misstep. But the barn smelled of dust and safety, and the wind had begun to cool in a way that made Emmett whimper against her chest. She nodded once. Jonas climbed the ladder first. Oliver followed, gripping each rung as if it might vanish. Margery lifted Emmett and climbed after them. Her palms were rough against the wood. On the loft floor lay blankets folded with surprising care. Jonas spread one out and sat with his back against the wall, his eyes still on the opening below. Margery lowered herself beside him. The straw whispered beneath her weight. Emmett stirred and settled again. She looked down at her sons, one too serious for his age, the other too frightened to remember laughter, and felt the familiar stab of guilt, but for the first time in weeks. That guilt wasn't tangled with dread. There was space here, space to breathe, to rest, if only for tonight, below. Graham moved through the barn with unhurried steps, checking the latch on the feed room, then the stall doors. The night breeze slipped in, brushing the lantern flame until it flickered. Jonas watched him as if he were watching a coyote, half wary, half fascinated by a creature whose intentions were unreadable. When Graham finally stepped back outside, Margery let her body sag. She didn't sleep, but she drifted near its edge, listening to the breaths of her children. The air cooled. The desert sang its quiet night song crickets, the far-off yip of a coyote, the soft creak of the barn settling. Sometime after the stars settled deep into the sky, Margery woke to Jonas shifting beside her, his head tilted toward the loft opening, alert. She followed his gaze. Below, a faint glow spilled across the dirt as Graham placed a small lantern on the step outside the barn door. He didn't look up. He simply left it there and walked away, his boots crunching softly in the gravel. Jonas exhaled, barely a breath. Something eased in his shoulders. Margery lay awake for a long while after that. By morning, the smell of coffee drifted from the house. Graham stood in the yard splitting a thick log, the sun lifting behind him. Jonas crept to the edge of the loft, watching each swing of the axe. There was precision in it, but no aggression, only rhythm. When Graham paused to wipe sweat from his brow, Jonas ducked back inside, but not before Graham's eyes flicked upward, catching the motion. Margery led her children down the ladder one by one. Oliver clung to her as they stepped into the brightness. The earth was cool underfoot still, not yet baked to stone. Graham nodded to her, then to the boys, as though greeting neighbors rather than wanderers. "I've beans warming on the stove," he said simply. "Coffee. 2. There's bread from yesterday." He glanced at the boys again. "Could use some help in the yard after you eat." Jonas straightened, pride flickering in his stance. Margery felt a pulse of something she didn't want to name. "We won't stay long," she murmured. "Long isn't something I measure," Graham replied, turning toward the house. "Inside." The kitchen smelled of coffee and old pine. Oliver hovered near Margery, wide-eyed. Jonas settled onto a stool, gripping a tin cup with both hands as if afraid it might vanish. Emmett lay bundled in a quilt Graham must have fetched from a cedar chest still faintly scented with wild sage. Margery chewed her bread slowly, afraid that eating too quickly would betray how desperately she wanted to devour it. Across the table, Graham ate in small, unhurried bites. He didn't pry, he didn't stare, but now and then he looked toward the boys with an expression Margery couldn't decipher, something between curiosity and a longing he didn't seem willing to acknowledge. After the meal, Graham stepped outside and handed Jonas a small axe. "Just the dead branches," he said. "Nothing too thick." Jonas held the handle with both hands. Reverent. Oliver crouched near the porch, digging his fingers into the dust. Margery meant to intervene, to take the axe back, but Graham's voice cut through her hesitation. "He needs something that feels like responsibility," he said gently. "Not burden, just purpose." She didn't know whether to argue or to thank him, so she said nothing. She watched Jonas follow Graham to the fence line, watched Oliver inch closer to them, watched a world she didn't yet trust begin to shift shape around her children. In the slow, shimmering light of mid-morning, something unfamiliar rippled through her chest. Not safety, not yet, but the memory of it. The rest of the day unfolded with an odd quiet. Jonas worked with fierce determination, mimicking Graham's movements. Oliver followed chickens with the hesitant fascination of a child relearning play. Margery swept the barn loft, beat dust from blankets, scrubbed clothes in the trough until her knuckles stung. Her body remembered the rhythm of survival. Her heart tried to recall the rhythm of hope. By late afternoon, Graham stood oiling the gears of the windmill. Margery paused in the doorway of the barn, watching him. Sunlight caught in the silver of the metal, in the strands of his wind-tossed hair, in the creases near his eyes. He glanced over his shoulder, just once, catching her watching him. She looked away too quickly. Her pulse stumbled. It was nothing, only a moment. But in Rio Seca, even a moment could feel like the start of something you didn't dare name. The drought tightened its grip on Rio Seca as days bled into one another. The sun rose harsh and unkind, the sky a relentless sheet of white-blue heat. Life inside Graham Walker's ranch moved with a quiet steadiness that unsettled Margery more than the wind ever had. Her sons were changing in ways she had not dared to imagine. Jonas walked taller, his eyes less hollow. Oliver no longer startled every time firelight flickered from the stove. Emmett slept deep enough that Margery sometimes bent close just to feel the warm puff of his breath. She knew she should be grateful. Instead, gratitude frightened her. Safety was a thing that could vanish overnight. She had already watched it burn once. When flour began to run low, Margery decided she would go into town alone. She told herself it was because she didn't want the boys exposed to curious stares. But the truth was simpler. She needed to know whether Rio Seca would tolerate her presence, whether she and her children could stay without becoming a curse on the man who had offered them shelter. The mercantile bell creaked as she pushed the door open. The air inside was dim and smelled of coffee grounds and sweat-soaked canvas. Two women stood by the bolts of fabric, their bonnets tilting toward one another like gossiping birds. Margery kept her gaze on the sacks of flour. She counted the coins in her hand twice, 3 small pieces. Barely enough. Still, she lifted a sack and approached the counter. Behind her, a voice rose low, amused, male. Well now, Sheriff Walker's got himself quite the stray. The bag grew heavy in her arms. She did not turn. Another voice, female this time, chimed in with a pity sweet enough to sting. He always did have a soft heart. Poor man. After what happened with his wife, I suppose a widow is better than no one at all. Laughter followed, sharp as cactus spines. Margery's breath thinned. The room tilted slightly. Her fingers tightened around the flour sack until her nails cut into the cloth. She heard footsteps approach. You reckon he picked her up on that road down south? The first man continued. Sounds like something he'd do. Always trying to fix broken things. Margery forced herself to look up. The man smirked, his thumbs hooked behind his suspenders. The two women stared at Margery's dress, at Emmett's blanket tucked beneath her arm, at her worn boots. Their eyes held no malice, only a curiosity mingled with disdain, a reminder that strangers were entertainment in a town bored by drought. He ain't doing himself any favors, the man added. Last wife left him for a real man with real land. Now he's keeping scraps. The word scraps sliced through her. She felt her pulse hammer beneath her ribs, felt the heat she had carried for miles rise to her face. Memories rushed back, neighbors whispering as the fire devoured her home, hands pulling her away from her screaming children, pitying eyes watching her crawl from ash with a newborn in her arms. Every humiliation she had endured since then now pooled inside her like smoke, choking the last clean breath from her lungs. The shopkeeper cleared his throat. You buying the flour or not? Ma'am. Her voice wouldn't come. She placed the coins on the counter with trembling fingers and turned before her shame spilled into tears. The bell above the door jangled as she fled into the scorching street. She didn't remember the walk back, only the weight of the flour, only the hollow throb behind her ribs. When the ranch finally appeared on the horizon, she quickened her pace, the boys' voices drifting faintly from the yard. Jonas was chopping small branches. Oliver was stacking stones. They looked settled, too settled, inside the barn. She set down the sack and knelt, fingers digging into the packed dirt. Her breath shook. She had wanted to give her sons a night of peace, nothing more. She had not meant to entangle them in a man's reputation or revive gossip about a sheriff who deserved far better than the shame she carried like a second skin. Before she realized she was moving, she was reaching for the boys' few belongings, Jonas's spare shirt, Oliver's ribbon, Emmett's blanket. Her hands trembled violently. Jonas appeared in the doorway, breathing hard from his work. "Mama," he whispered, "why are you packing?" She couldn't answer. Her throat was a fist. "Did he ask us to leave?" Jonas's voice cracked in a way that made her heart lurch. "No," she managed, "but we cannot stay. Not after today. I won't be the reason they speak his name with scorn." Jonas stepped closer. "He won't care what they say." "He should," she said sharply, more to herself than to him. "He deserves better than what follows us." Graham's shadow fell across the ground before she heard him. He had returned earlier than she expected. Dust clung to his boots, his shirt damp along the collar. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scattered belongings, the fear in Oliver's eyes, the shaking in Margery's hands. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Margery swallowed hard. "I'm leaving." He didn't move. "Why?" She wanted to rise, but her knees wouldn't obey. "Because they're talking about you, about me, about your wife, about why you would lower yourself to help a woman like me." Something in his face darkened, not anger, but pain freshly disturbed. He stepped inside, slow as if approaching a wounded animal. Jonas shifted protectively in front of her, but Graham stopped well short of them. "They said, I'm broken," Margery whispered. "A burden, scraps, and they're using your name to say it louder." Graham's jaw tightened for a moment. He looked toward the open barn doors, toward the flat stretch of Rio Seca, as if he might stare the entire town into silence. Then his gaze returned to her, steady and unflinching. "They can talk about me all they want," he said, voice low and rough. "But they don't get to talk about you." The words hit her harder than the gossip ever had. Her breath hitched. Jonas looked from one adult to the other, finally sensing that something larger than the town's cruelty hung between them. Margery shook her head weakly. "I don't want to ruin your name." Graham's eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. "My name doesn't break that easy. And if I let you walk out because of them, I deserve whatever they say." Silence settled a fragile, trembling thing. Then he added, quieter still, "Don't go, Margery. Not because of them." Her hands loosened on the bundle of clothes. The barn seemed to exhale around them, and for the first time since the fire, she felt something other than fear rising in her chest, something that sounded dangerously like hope. The barn felt impossibly still after his words. Dust hung suspended in the warm, late afternoon light, shimmering like the soft confession of a world trying to stay quiet. Margery remained on her knees, breath uneven, her fingers resting atop the half-folded shirt She no longer had the strength to lift. Jonas stood protectively in front of her, small and fierce, like a sentinel carved out of fear and loyalty. Graham didn't try to come closer. He simply waited. The way he stood, hands loose at his sides, chest rising with the steady patience of a man who'd weathered storms without leaning on anyone, told her he wouldn't force her to stay. But neither would he let her slip into the night believing she had ruined something she hadn't even touched. "Jonas," Graham said quietly, never taking his eyes from Margery. "Would you check the gate for me? The west hinge has been sticking." Jonas hesitated, caught between duty and worry. But Margery touched his wrist gently. "Go on," she murmured. "I'll be right here." When the boy finally stepped out, Oliver followed him, dragging Emmett's blanket behind him like a tether to safety. The barn door eased shut on its hinges, leaving Margery and Graham alone in the amber hush. She exhaled shakily. "I didn't want them to hear the things I heard today. I didn't want them thinking their shame in accepting kindness." "There isn't," Graham said. "I know," she swallowed. "But people don't care about truth. They care about stories, and they're already telling one about us." A ghost of a smile flickered across his lips, not amusement, but a weary knowing. "They've been telling stories about me for years." His gaze lowered briefly, then lifted again. Some of them true. Some twisted to make sense of things that never made sense at all. She looked down at her hands. Scars crossed her knuckles from nights spent clawing through debris for anything worth saving. "What did they say about your wife?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Graham's breath hitched barely perceptibly, as if she'd brushed a bruise that never healed. "That I wasn't enough for her," he said. "That a man with a small ranch and small dreams isn't worth staying for. That I wore the badge because it was the only real thing I had." Margery's eyes rose to meet his. For the first time, she saw not just the sheriff, but the man beneath the badge, one who had been measured by wealth and found lacking. "That wasn't true," she whispered. He shook his head slowly. Didn't matter. She believed it. And when she walked out that door, part of me believed it too. Margery felt a sting behind her ribs. She knew that kind of wound, the one inflicted by someone who should have held you closest, who instead left you carrying the weight of their disappointment. "I'm not her," she said quietly. "I know." The words came quickly, too quickly, as if he had been holding them for days. "You're nothing like her." Silence deepened, but it wasn't cold. It was warm and restless, like the breath before rain. "Margery," he continued, voice gentler now, "you walked all this way carrying 3 children, with nothing but grit keeping you upright. You think I don't see that? You think I don't know strength when it's right in front of me?" She blinked hard. The floor blurred. "Strength doesn't keep a family from burning," she whispered. "No," he agreed, "but it keeps them alive afterward." The words hit deep, sliding past defenses she'd held tight since the night flames swallowed her world. She pressed her hand to her chest, as if trying to hold in the sudden ache. "I'm tired, Graham," she confessed. "I'm so tired of being lost, of running." "You don't have to run," he said. Then, more softly, "Not from me." Her breath trembled. A question surfaced before she could stop it. "And if staying ruins your name?" He shook his head. "My name His voice was a rough whisper. Has nothing to do with who people say I am, and everything to do with who I choose to stand beside. Margery let her eyes fall closed. The barn smelled of hay and dust, and the faint sweetness of old wood scents she hadn't realized she associated with safety until this moment. When she opened her eyes again, Graham wasn't closer, but something about him felt nearer, like a door he'd kept locked had swung half open without a sound. He nodded toward the folded clothes in her lap. "Leave the packing for now," he said. "Sit with me a moment." She rose slowly, legs trembling, and crossed the small distance between them. They sat against opposite beams, not touching, but connected by a quiet that carried more truth than any confession for a long while. The only sound was the windmill creaking in the heated breeze, steady as breath. Margery didn't cry, but something in her loosened, like a knot pulled free. Graham looked at her with a softness so careful she almost didn't recognize it. "If morning comes and you still want to leave," he said, "I'll hitch the wagon and ride the first miles beside you, so no one thinks you were cast out." She stared at him, stunned by the gentleness of that offer. No insistence, no fear, only respect, wrapped in quiet resolve. But somewhere inside her, the choice was already shifting. "I don't know what I want yet," she admitted. "That's all right," he murmured. "You've got time." For the first time in months, time didn't feel like something that chased her. It felt like something that waited. Dawn slipped gently over Rio Seca, turning the barn loft into a soft cradle of gold. Margery woke to the sound of her son's breathing steadily beside her, peaceful, in a way she had not heard since before the fire. Emmett stirred, warm against her shoulder, and Jonas and Oliver rose with the slow, unhurried movements of children who no longer expected danger at waking. Outside, the morning air carried a rare coolness. Graham was already in the yard checking a saddle strap when he looked up and saw them. Something quiet eased across his face, not a smile, but a softening that felt just as warm. Jonas stepped forward, holding the small axe Graham had given him. "The handle's loose," he murmured. "Can you fix it?" Graham nodded, a brief but steady gesture that told Margery the boy had found a place to set down a piece of his fear. Breakfast was simple bread warmed on the stove, bitter coffee, but the silence around the table felt whole rather than empty. When the boys ran outside afterward, Margery remained on the porch, watching them move with a new lightness. Graham joined her, careful to keep a respectful distance. "You still planning to leave?" he asked quietly. Margery watched Jonas lift Oliver over the fence, Emmett blinking toward the sun from her arms. The ache in her chest loosened. "I was," she whispered, "but they're different today." "So am I." Graham nodded once. "Then stay." She set down the small bundle she had packed the night before. The wind brushed past, carrying dust and the faint, unexpected scent of sage. Beside the porch step, a single green blade of grass pushed through the cracked earth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to begin again.